At 0317 hours, the escort screen stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like a trap. The Strait of Hormuz was a black seam between continents, moonless, wind-lashed, and tight enough to turn every maneuver into a test of nerve. It was 43 minutes before dawn. Low clouds sat heavy over the water, sealing off the stars. Visibility was 4 nautical miles at best. A northeasterly wind at 21 knots sheared whitecaps off the tops of short, violent swells. Tankers farther south moved as dimmed silhouettes. Their navigation lights looked less like commerce than distant embers floating in a graveyard. And at the center of that darkness, inside the layered escort ring around a U.S. carrier strike group, something came in fast. Not a radar ghost, not a drifting contact, not a mistake. An Iranian fast attack craft punched through a seam in the screen at 46 knots and drove straight toward the escort line as if the captain had decided that the only thing more dangerous than an American carrier was hesitating in front of one. I'm your host at World Defense, where we break down the operations shaping global security. And what unfolded next was not just another close call at sea, it was a brutal lesson for any force that thinks speed and chaos can outrun layered American naval power. The U.S. carrier at the center of the formation was USS Ronald Reagan, operating with a protective shell of destroyers, aircraft, helicopters, and subsurface coverage as she transited one of the most politically explosive waterways on Earth. 22 nautical miles to the northeast, Iranian coastal batteries sat under hardened shelters. 12 nautical miles to the north, radar clutter from the littoral mixed with fishing contacts, patrol returns, and civilian traffic. The choke point was exactly the kind of environment Tehran loved. Compressed, noisy, full of ambiguity. Perfect for aggression wrapped in deniability. The aggressor that morning was not a frigate or submarine. It was a pack leader among Iranian patrol boats, a heavily armed fast-inshore attack craft riding low and hard in the water, built for speed, intimidation, and sudden violence inside restricted seas. Her hull was compact but dangerous. Twin engines shoved her at 46 knots. Mounted forward was a stabilized heavy gun. Along her flanks sat anti-armor rockets and short-range anti-ship punch meant for swarm harassment or high-risk close assaults. Behind her, in staggered spacing, 3 additional boats were following at 39 to 42 knots, each trying to use weather, clutter, and merchant traffic to conceal the final geometry of the approach. At 0314 hours. The lead Iranian boat had been 17.8 nautical miles from the outer edge of the U.S. escort screen. At 0315, she was inside 14 miles. By 0316 hours and 22 seconds, she crossed 9.6 nautical miles and still did not answer hails. Her bow was up, engines screaming, spray breaking high enough to mask her signature every few seconds on surface search radar. To the untrained eye, it might have looked reckless. To an operations room, it looked intentional. The Iranian side was running on confidence sharpened by proximity. Their pilots and coxswains knew these waters. They knew how often civilian clutter complicated responses. They knew how narrow the political line could be between warning, harassment, and open engagement. They believed the carrier group would hesitate. They believed that if they burst close enough, fast enough, they could stage a confrontation inside the Americans' own protective bubble and force a public embarrassment. Maybe a near collision, maybe a mock firing pass, maybe a weapons lock. Maybe something even uglier. They also believed they were looking at ships. What they didn't know was that the US Navy had already been tracking the approach pattern for 48 hours. The surveillance picture had begun ashore, not at sea. Satellite imagery had picked up unusual fuel and weapons loading activity at an Iranian small craft facility on the mainland coast. A P-8 Poseidon operating outside the densest threat envelope had mapped movement patterns overnight, correlating hulls, wakes, and departure times against historical harassment profiles. Signals teams had flagged short-range maritime circuit traffic, compressed and disciplined, inconsistent with routine patrol coordination. Surface combatants in the carrier group had been silently refining clutter discrimination in anticipation of a rush. And beneath the surface, a US submarine trailing the broader lane had been feeding acoustic context into the theater picture, stripping away the illusion that a crowded strait could hide, intent forever. By the time the Iranian boats accelerated for the final run, the American commanders were no longer asking whether a confrontation was possible. They were waiting to see how far Tehran would push it. At 0316 hours and 41 seconds, one of the outer screen Arleigh Burke-class destroyers sharpened the picture. The SPY-1D radar had enough track quality now to classify the lead boat as a probable hostile fast attack craft rather than merchant debris or coastal transit. Electronic support measures found intermittent emissions consistent with onboard targeting electronics. Optical systems pushed magnified infrared onto the command displays. Spray peeled off the Iranian hull in long white sheets. Topside crew movement was visible. A weapon mount had shifted. Then came the voice. Surface contact, bearing 018, range 8.9 nautical miles. Speed 4 to 6 knots, tracking inbound. No urgency in the tone, no confusion. Just information delivered with the calm of a navy that had practiced for this exact moment. Inside the Iranian lead boat, the emotional temperature ran hotter. The crew believed the American screen was a wall built by caution. Their commander believed that if he drove straight into it, he could force the wall to blink. He wanted proximity. He wanted reaction. He wanted a camera-worthy moment of defiance inside sight of a US carrier escort. He wanted the story later told in reverse, that Iranian courage had broken American nerve. At 0317 hours and 03 seconds, the American destroyer transmitted the first warning over bridge-to-bridge and secure maritime channels. Iranian patrol craft, this is United States Navy warship. You are on unsafe approach vector to a protected formation. Alter course immediately to 080. Reduce speed to 5 knots. Acknowledge now. No answer. At 0317 hours and 19 seconds, the second warning went out, broader and colder. Iranian patrol craft, you are closing a US carrier escort. Maintain separation. Any aggressive maneuver will be treated as hostile intent. Still nothing. The lead boat kept coming. Distance fell with murderous speed. 8.1 nautical miles, 7.4, 6.8. The US screen held formation, but inside that discipline, 100 invisible adjustments were already underway. One destroyer altered 6 degrees to starboard to tighten intercept geometry. Another increased to 24 knots to close a potential escape lane to the southeast. An MH-60R Seahawk already airborne on sector patrol banked lower and shifted its sensor cone onto the incoming craft. A second helicopter was brought to launch readiness on short notice. Combat information centers across the screen synchronized tracks. Guns came alive, safeties came off. There was no drama in it, only procedure. The Iranian lead craft crossed 5.2 nautical miles at 46 knots. That was when the situation changed from dangerous to unstable, because the lead boat did not merely maintain course, it accelerated. At 0318 hours and 04 seconds, her speed hit 49 knots. A trailing boat peeled slightly west, the kind of move that in a different context could mean spacing. In this one, it looked like flanking behavior. Another boat widened just enough to create uncertainty over whether the pack intended a split rush around the escort picket. On infrared, the patterns were unmistakable. This was not transit. This was a coordinated aggressive intercept. The destroyer repeated the warning one final time. Iranian patrol craft, this is your last warning. Kill speed now. Turn away now. You are entering weapons engagement criteria. The first real sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong came 14 seconds later. Not from the Iranian boats, from the water. At 0318 hours and 26 seconds, a RHIB assigned to a visit, board, search, and seizure team from the escort screen reported engine failure and collision damage after being struck by a crossing wake and debris during the rapid defensive repositioning. The rigid hull inflatable had been conducting a short-range security transfer between screen elements under controlled conditions when the Iranian rush forced abrupt maneuver changes across the sector. In a sea already running rough, the RHIB slammed hard, lost propulsion, and dropped off the net in the confusion. 2 sailors were still aboard. A Naval Special Warfare Detachment attached for maritime interdiction support had a small team nearby preparing for contingency operations. Suddenly, contingency became reality. At 03:18 hours and 42 seconds, the call hit the circuit. Small boat disabled, 2 personnel in the water, position grid follows, possible drift toward hostile approach lane. And just like that, the tactical problem doubled. Now there were 2 clocks running, one toward a potential Iranian close-in confrontation with a US carrier escort, the other toward men in the water in black, wind-driven seas less than 7 nautical miles from an inbound hostile craft. On the Iranian side, no one knew yet. Their focus was forward, on the destroyer silhouette and the prestige of forcing contact. On the American side, the picture snapped into perfect brutality. This was no longer simply about deterrence. A rescue had to happen under threat, in darkness, in open water, with hostile high-speed craft bearing down on the same patch of sea. At 03:19 hours, the strike group's response fractured into precise, simultaneous layers. One layer would stop the Iranian rush. One layer would isolate the sea space. One layer would pull American personnel out alive. The destroyer nearest the inbound craft shifted to blocking posture and ordered crew-served weapons to warning ready. A second Arleigh Burt-class destroyer accelerated to seal the southern lane. The carrier's air wing pushed an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye farther forward to harden the air and surface picture. The MH-60R already on station was reassigned from surveillance to immediate rescue support. And from a darkened deck farther back in the formation, a Naval Special Warfare quick reaction element began moving. By 03:19 hours and 21 seconds, the Iranian lead boat was inside 4.6 nautical miles. The destroyer's gunnery officer had a clean visual through stabilized optics. The coxswain's outline was visible behind the windshield. Forward-mounted weapon station. Heat bloom from engines. Spray exploding from the chine line. The boat looked less like a vessel than a bullet. The order came in 3 words: show them steel. At 03:19 hours and 34 seconds, the destroyer fired warning flares in an unmistakable burst of illumination into the darkness off the Iranian bow. The water lit white-green. The lead craft slammed through the edge of the glare and did not turn. A second later, the destroyer's loudhailer repeated the final warning over the roaring wind. Iranian craft, turn away immediately. For one frozen heartbeat, it looked like the lead boat might comply. It did not. Instead, the coxswain shoved harder, angling to slice between the destroyer and the outer screen lane. One of the trailing craft widened to port. Another tightened inward. Whether the intent was a swarm, a bluff, or a desperate test no longer mattered. The geometry had crossed the line. At 03:20 hours and 02 seconds, the US Navy executed the first hard response. A precision-disabling burst struck the waterline just ahead of the lead Iranian boat, then walked across its port engine housing with surgical control. The effect was immediate. Spray changed shape. Exhaust flashed. The boat yawed violently left, corrected, then lost speed in a plume of churned foam and smoke. It did not explode. It did not need to. Its sprint died in 6 seconds. The trailing boats saw it happen. Confidence broke. One peeled outward. One hesitated. One kept coming just long enough to convince the Americans it had not yet understood the situation. At 03:20 hours and 21 seconds, the second US destroyer cut across the likely escape vector and illuminated the entire lane with targeting quality optics. At almost the same moment, the MH-60R overhead painted the drifting RHIB position and dropped into a lower orbit despite gusts and spray. On the rescue net, the voice was clipped but steady. Visual on debris field. No visual on both personnel. Beginning search pattern. Then a sharper voice from the sea. Man in water. One survivor. Marking. The rescue had begun. This was the point where the incident split into 2 emotional realities. For the Iranians, the rush had gone from bravado to confusion. Their lead boat was crippled and wallowing. The American escorts were not backing off. They were expanding. Helicopters were overhead, sensors were everywhere. And suddenly there were more US hulls moving than any small boat commander wanted to count in darkness. The men who had imagined themselves forcing a close encounter with a carrier group now had to decide whether to die proving a point or break contact while they still could. For the Americans, the aggression was not over, but the priority had shifted. Men were in the water. That makes every second personal. At 0320 hours and 47 seconds, the first survivor was hauled by rescue strop toward the hovering Seahawk, fighting wind, shock, and waves. He was conscious, breathing, injured but responsive. He shouted there was still another man out there, and one SEAL attached to the security element had gone overboard trying to stabilize the RHIB after the impact. That changed the rescue profile instantly. 2 in the water, 1 sailor, 1 operator. Black Seas. Hostile boats still maneuvering in the outer ring. At 0321 hours, the Naval Special Warfare Quick Reaction Package launched. They were not coming in to fight a conventional boarding action. They were coming because few forces on Earth are built to recover people from contested water at night with the clock collapsing around them. The team moved aboard another RHIB under cover of the destroyer's lee, while a second MH-60R spun up to provide armed overwatch. Their mission was simple in wording and vicious in execution. Get to the drift line, recover the missing personnel, and get out before any Iranian craft regained the courage to rush the scene again. At 0321 hours and 26 seconds, the damaged Iranian lead boat attempted to reorient its forward gun. The answer was immediate. A second disabling burst shredded the mount and threw fragments into the sea. The boat stopped being a threat and became wreckage with a flag on it. The 2 trailing Iranian craft finally made the correct calculation. They turned north at high speed, throwing spray and trying to get back under the umbrella of coastal clutter. A 4th craft lingered just long enough to be boxed by radar and optics from 2 American warships and 1 armed helicopter. It did not test the box, it ran. That should have ended the confrontation. It did not, because the rescue zone was still not safe. The drifting debris from the downed RHIB had spread across a widening patch of water. Fuel shimmered in places on the swell tops. 1 life ring had floated 180 meters from the original disablement point. A broken equipment case was found 260 meters farther east. The missing men had been carried by current and wind into a dark, unstable corridor between screen elements. The first Seahawk could not stay indefinitely at low hover in those conditions. The second helicopter had to split time between overwatch and search, and every commander in the area knew that if Tehran chose to send fresh boats from shore, the rescue window would get uglier by the minute. At 0322 hours and 18 seconds, the NSW RHIB cleared the destroyer's shadow and slammed into open water. The ride was savage. Waves hit hard enough to throw knees into shock absorbers and shoulders into safety straps. Night vision turned the sea into moving charcoal and silver. The coxswain drove by instruments, infrared cues, and discipline. A gunner scanned starboard. Another man leaned over the bow rail, searching for human shape in broken whitewater. The team leader did not yell. He did not need to. Every man on that boat already understood that the margin between rescue and recovery was now measured in seconds and luck. Overhead, the Seahawk called it. Possible head. Bearing 062, range 140 meters from flare marker. The NSW RHIB turned. For 3 seconds there was nothing, then a hand, then a shoulder, then a body rolling in the swell, barely visible between wave crests. The missing sailor came aboard first at 0322 hours and 59 seconds, half conscious and drowning in cold spray, dragged over the tube by 3 pairs of hands in one smooth, violent motion. He was alive, hypothermic, bleeding from the forehead, breathing raggedly. The medic shoved him down, cut straps, checked airway, moved on. Because the SEAL was still missing. At 0323 hours, a voice on the rescue circuit caught him for half a second. Strobe. Weak strobe. Bearing 085. The operator had done the one thing that keeps chaos from winning at sea. He had made himself findable. The NSWR-HIB drove again. Stern slamming, bow rising, men scanning through blown mist and rotor wash flicker from the helicopter overhead. Then the beam found him. Face up, one arm half functional, tether fouled around debris, still alive but drifting toward the edge of the protective envelope. That edge mattered because 2.8 nautical miles away, one of the Iranian retreating craft had slowed. Maybe to look, maybe to report, maybe to measure whether one last ugly move was still possible. The Americans saw it instantly. At 0323 hours and 19 seconds, the nearest destroyer issued a fresh warning. Iranian craft bearing 014, maintain course away. Any return toward the rescue area will be met with immediate fire. The craft accelerated away. American dominance returned to the scene like a door slamming shut. At 0323 hours and 44 seconds, the SEAL came aboard. He was conscious for only part of it. Enough to grab a wrist, enough to cough, enough to curse once through seawater and blood before the medic shoved him flat and started working. Shoulder likely dislocated. Possible rib fractures, severe exhaustion, but alive. And that was the moment the rescue became victory. Not strategic victory, not political victory. Something more immediate. The kind measured by pulse, airway, and the simple fact of not leaving your people in the water while an enemy watches. The NSWRHIB turned back for the destroyer under armed helicopter cover. The first rescued sailor was already wrapped, oxygen on, responding. The SEAL drifted in and out, eyes open only in flashes under green chem-light glow and red medical lamps. Around them, the strike group reassembled its shape, not with panic, but with the cold competence of a machine returning to geometry after impact. At 0324 hours, the carrier group had fully seized the battle space. USS Ronald Reagan remained protected at the center. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers held crossing control. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser farther out hardened the broader air defense and surface picture. MH-60R Seahawks maintained overhead coverage with rescue and armed overwatch roles split cleanly. Combat air patrol from the carrier stretched a wider lid above the strait in case shore-based aircraft or drones tried to complicate the withdrawal. Electronic warfare teams listened for any sign that coastal missile batteries or additional patrol craft were being queued. Nothing came, because the message had landed. The Iranians had rushed into a U.S. carrier escort believing speed created initiative. Instead, they had run headfirst into layered radar, disciplined command and control, armed helicopters, overlapping destroyer geometry, and a force calm enough to fight and rescue at the same time. At 0325 hours and 17 seconds, the crippled Iranian lead boat was dead in the water, crew visible, no longer maneuvering. The 3 surviving companion craft were northbound and opening range, speed fluctuating between 31 and 38 knots as they tried to disappear into the coastward clutter they had trusted from the beginning. Their confidence was gone now, not because they had been sunk, because they had been dominated without ambiguity. Their sprint had ended in disablement. Their intimidation had produced a rescue operation under American control. Their presence had changed nothing about the safety of the carrier. In the American rescue chain, the next battle was medical. The recovered sailor had aspirated seawater and suffered blunt force trauma from the RHIB impact. The SEAL had likely been in the water just under 5 minutes, long enough in those conditions to move from fighting to fading. Corpsmen on the destroyer met the returning NSWRHIB at the rail with litters, straps, and a choreography that looked simple only because they had drilled it until simplicity was all that remained. At 0326 hours and 08 seconds, both men were transferred aboard. At 0326 hours and 54 seconds, the sailor was in the treatment bay. At 0327 hours and 11 seconds, the SEAL was being stabilized for probable transfer by helicopter. At 0328 hours, the first report went up the chain. Both personnel recovered alive. That line traveled faster than any propaganda clip ever could. By 0330 hours, the tactical picture was effectively closed. No additional Iranian boats entered the rescue zone. No missiles lit from shore. No drones materialized overhead. The Americans had acted too fast, too cleanly, and with too much layered certainty for the situation to remain attractive to anyone on the other side of it. But the emotional residue lingered. On the Iranian side, humiliation came in stages. First, the realization that the Escort had not panicked. Then the realization that American sensors had tracked every move before the rush fully developed. Then the worst realization of all. While Tehran's boats were trying to manufacture a spectacle, the US Navy had protected the carrier, disabled the attack, and still had enough control left over to launch and complete a contested rescue. That is the sort of thing regional commanders remember long after official statements are written. On the American side, there was no triumphalism in the immediate aftermath. Only checks, rechecks, medical updates, fuel states, weapons status, deck cycle timing, search certainty, confirmation that no one else was missing. But inside that professionalism was an unmistakable truth. The force had been tested in the dark, in compressed water, against an aggressive close-in move and a sudden rescue crisis, and it had not broken rhythm. At 0334 hours, the SEAL was transferred by helicopter for advanced treatment. At 0337 hours, the damaged Iranian lead craft began taking outside assistance from a slower support vessel approaching from the north under careful American observation. At 0341 hours, the strike group widened separation and resumed controlled transit with altered escort spacing to compensate for the disabled RHIB. At 0348 hours, the final immediate action summary was already circulating through command channels. Hostile intercept attempt disrupted, lead aggressor disabled. 3 accompanying craft retreated. 2 US personnel recovered alive. Carrier protected, sea control maintained. That summary was clinical. The reality underneath it was not, because modern naval power is not tested only when missiles fly or ships sink. Sometimes it is tested when chaos appears in the narrow gap between deterrence and disaster. A hostile craft rushes an escort. A small boat goes dead in bad water. Men go overboard in darkness. The force has to decide whether it can dominate the enemy and save its own at the same time. That morning, the US Navy answered yes. The incident also revealed something deeper about the psychology of maritime confrontation. Iran had counted on compression, narrow sea room, political ambiguity, the hope that proximity would force hesitation. But layered naval power turns compression into vulnerability for the side with fewer sensors, fewer options, and less disciplined command. In open water, speed can feel like freedom. In a choke point watched by destroyers, helicopters, submarines, and airborne battle management, speed becomes exposure. That is why the rescue mattered so much. Not because a SEAL rescue is dramatic on camera, not because the phrase itself carries myth, but because it demonstrated that even after a hostile rush broke the calm, the Americans still owned the timeline. They chose when to warn. They chose when to disable. They chose how far to escalate. They chose how to carve out a safe corridor in black water, and they chose not to leave their people behind. For the broader balance of naval power, the lesson is merciless. A carrier escort is not just a ring of ships. It is a living architecture of surveillance, communications, weapons, aviation, rescue capacity, and command discipline. A fast attack craft can enter that ring. It can shock it for a moment. It can create danger. But unless it can blind the network, outrun the helicopters, split the destroyers, and survive the response, all it has really done is volunteer itself for demonstration. And in the Strait of Hormuz that morning, demonstration became consequence. Iran rushed into a US carrier escort. 14 minutes later, a SEAL rescue was underway in contested water. Minutes after that, the attackers were running. The carrier was secure, and the Americans had taken chaos and bent it back into control. That is what sea power looks like now. Not noise, not swagger, not slogans shouted over a radio. It is the ability to fight in darkness, rescue under pressure, and keep the center of the formation untouched while the enemy discovers too late that the screen around a carrier is not a boundary, it is a verdict.